15. Using a textbook. Hey Alex. Okay? So this is the first of a series of letters about the specific sources of legal information that you'll be drawing on in your studies. We'll start with textbooks. The basic approach. As I said in the previous letter, when you go through a chapter or chapters from a textbook for the first time, your aim should just be to read it. If you take any notes, it should just be of key concepts, ideas, case names, and statutory provisions that you will need to remember for later. What you have to avoid is getting stuck making very detailed notes that will slow your progress down, frustrate you, and prevent you ever getting onto anything else in the time available to you. But when you read a chapter or chapters from a textbook for the first time, you do actually have to read the textbook. That means going through it somewhere you can actually concentrate on the book and won't get distracted by other people or other things. So find somewhere that works for you to allow you to read without distraction. A library or your room with the TV and computer off, or a comfortable chair in a coffee shop. But find somewhere. And when you go through the book, remember, keep asking, why is this important? What are the key points here? What is this area of law about? What problems is it trying to solve? What are the key case statutory provisions? After you have gone through everything else you are supposed to read, you should then return to the textbook with the benefit of all the knowledge you've picked up in the meantime. This time round, you will make notes on various points that you come across in the textbook, one, that are important, and two, that you are not already familiar with from your other reading. Past paper questions which you should have looked at before you started any reading, and your lectures will provide a guide as to one. On two, try to avoid wasting time making notes of the obvious. For example, if you are studying contract law, you will soon find out that promises aren't automatically legally binding, and that usually something consideration has to be given in return for a promise to make that binding. Neither of those points is worth wasting a scrap of paper or a second of your time on noting. They are so foundational to the subject that you won't need to make a note of them to remember them. You will be reminded of them by everything else you read. That's one reason for leaving detailed note-taking from your textbooks to much later in your reading. It's only then that you are able to differentiate between points that are important, but so obvious they're not worth noting, and points that are important, but not so obvious or memorable that you'll be able to get away with not making a note of them. And as I said in the previous letter, make sure your notes are fun and interesting, that you are constantly creating and thinking while making notes on your textbook. For example, I enclosed the preface to the third edition of my tort textbook. One, it's still relevant, even though there's now a fourth edition in print. Have a look at it, and think about how you would take some notes on it. At the end of this letter, you'll find one fun and interesting way that I thought the information in that preface could be represented for a student's notes. Further tips. 1. Don't rely too much on your textbooks. One of the most important differences between doing a levels and doing a law degree is the attitude you should have towards your textbooks. At a level, you could count on your textbooks to be correct and to tell you everything you needed to know to get a good grade in your exams. Neither of these things is likely to be true of the textbooks you will be looking at when doing a law degree. First of all, legal textbooks frequently get the law wrong or make statements or assumptions about the law that are debatable. So if a textbook says, "The law says X," you shouldn't necessarily think that the law does actually say X. Secondly, most textbooks do not tell you everything you need to know about the law to get a good mark in the exams. For reasons of space, most textbooks do not spend much time discussing how the law should be developed or reformed, and any discussion of such issues is likely to be quite superficial. For in-depth discussions of how the law should be reformed or developed, you need to look at monographs, short books on a single issue, or articles. In addition, most textbooks play safe and spend almost all of their time simply reporting what the decided cases say. They spend very little time going beyond the cases and discussing what the legal position is in various hypothetical, problematic situations. But these are precisely the sort of situations you are likely to be confronted with in your exams. So you should treat textbooks as fallible introductions to the various subjects you are studying. They get you started, and give you some idea of terrain over which you are going to be moving, but it's dangerous to over-rely on them. 2. Picking which textbook to make your principal guide. In any subject, there are going to be lots of different textbooks about that subject. Which one should you use? Your teachers will probably have a recommendation, and if so, go with that. But in some cases, they will just list a variety of textbooks and leave it up to you to choose. So how do you choose? Asking students in the year above you for their advice might be an idea, though watch out for slackers who recommend a really slim volume as telling you all you need to know. If you want to do badly in the exams, that is. And also look out for someone who is just trying to sell you his or her textbooks regardless of whether they were any good. Going to your university law library or a good university bookstore with a wide selection of law books and looking through the range of recommended textbooks to see if any of them catch your eye as being particularly readable and interesting would also be a good idea. Try not to select a textbook on price alone. £5 or £10 extra is a very small price to pay for getting a book that will make a major difference to the quality of your understanding of the law. Some textbooks that might appear on your reading lists or lecture handouts tend to be more oriented towards legal professionals. Treadle on Contract or Megarry and Wade's Law of Real Property are 2 examples. Don't be put off by the fact that they are mainly for professionals. The level of detail could really help you with your studies. However, if you use one of those textbooks, you have to be prepared to skip past major chunks of text as not being relevant to your studies. 3. Consult more than one textbook. So, let's assume you are now armed with your principal textbook. However, for the reasons stated in one above, it's dangerous to rely on just one textbook. No one textbook can be the font of all wisdom on a particular subject, though some textbooks come closer than others. If you take virtually any legal textbook, there are going to be some chapters where the writers did a really good job, and some chapters where the writers weren't quite on their game. So you shouldn't just ignore or write off the other textbooks that deal with the subject you are studying. If you have time, after you have done everything else you have to do, you should have a look at any other relevant textbooks stocked in your university library to see what they have to say about the particular area of law you are studying. 4. Remember that textbooks get out of date. This point may be a bit too obvious to be worth making, but it sometimes catches inexperienced students out. There are some areas of law that change quite a lot over short periods of time. Tort law and criminal law are examples, with the result that textbooks in those areas get out of date quite quickly. If you are studying one of these areas, be careful about using a textbook which is more than 3 or 4 years old. Many of its statements about what the law says could be out of date. Though if you are, as I advise, consulting a variety of textbooks, you'll soon detect any out-of-date statements. And if you are buying a textbook secondhand, particularly from a student in one of the years above you, make sure that it hasn't been superseded by a later edition. If it has, then be careful. Certainly don't buy it if it is 4 or 5 years out of date. If it's only 2 years out of date, a lot of publishers now like to bring out new editions of legal textbooks every 2 years, then it might still be serviceable for your purposes. But certainly don't pay more than about £5 for it. 5. Look at the footnotes. Don't ignore the footnotes in a textbook. They can often be the source of A. Very useful observations about the law, which didn't fit easily into the flow of the main text, and were therefore relegated to the footnotes. B. Suggestions as to articles and other books that it might be helpful to read, and if you are really lucky, summaries of what those articles and books say, thus saving the trouble of looking at them yourself. C. Criticisms of other writers' views, which will come in handy when trying to make up your mind whose views you agree or disagree with. 6. Boredom. If you're getting bored reading a textbook, what should you do? Note that this is highly unlikely to happen if you adopt the above approach to going through the textbook. The answer is, stop reading. If you're bored, you won't be taking anything in, and there's no point in carrying on reading when you're not taking in anything of what you're reading. Deal with the source of the boredom before you carry on reading. It may be that you've been working too long and your brain has decided it's had enough, in which case, take a break. Or it may be that the textbook is at fault. The writer hasn't made enough effort to make the bit of the textbook you are reading sufficiently interesting. In which case, search out another textbook that covers the same area but is more interesting. Or it may be that there's something on your mind that stops you focusing on what the textbook has to say. In which case, deal with the thing that's on your mind and then come back to the textbook. Easier said than done in many cases, I know. That's all I have to say on going through textbooks. Reading cases is next. Best wishes, Nick.